Welcome to another edition of Trail Runner Nation. My name is Don Freeman.
And I'm Scott Warr. And we are part of a really cool community. And to really understand who we are as a running community, what drives us, what connects us, and why we keep pushing our limits, we have to look back and look at our history. Long before ultras, Strava segments, and finish line belt buckles, there was a thing called pedestrianism, and we actually have done some episodes on pedestrianism. It was a 19th century spectacle where athletes raced for 6 days in a row inside these smoky arenas. Our resident sports historian, Davy Crockett, is back. He's been on our podcast many times, and he's back to introduce us to one of the most unforgettable figures from that era. His name was Peter Napoleon Campana. I don't know if do you pronounce it Campana or Campana?
I do it Campana. He wasn't Latin.
Anyway, Davey just wrote another one of his books. He has a series of history books, and this is the latest. And we're going to learn about this guy. Davey, before we get specifically into this Peter Napoleon Campana, what have you learned from doing all this historical research about our sport and our community? Through all that research, has it changed you as an ultra runner?
Well, just the fact that back then in that era, about a 25-year era, they held at least 500 of these 6-day races, most of them indoors. And before my research, nobody understood that there were that many. I thought there were maybe a couple dozen, but it was the main type of race for ultra running. It was. I mean, there were some 100-mile races and some shorter races, but the 6-day race was it, and it was it because that's where the money was. You follow the money, and these guys wanted to enter the sport because they could get rich and be famous and totally changed their lives in just 1 week if they did well. And that type of sport is totally foreign to us today, but it makes me appreciate how good those runners were. A lot of times we think, people back in the 19th century or further, they're okay, but they weren't very good runners. But these guys, if they had the type of shoes and fueling and things that we had, they would compete with some of the best in the world. I think some of them were extremely good and had amazing endurance. So it's just a fascinating era of the sport that most people just didn't understand even existed.
Now, this individual that you wrote this last book on, evidently, I don't know if he ever won a race, but how did this guy come to the top of the cream of all of the people that you could write about? Why did he come to the top of your mind?
Well, because he was a character. While he never won a 6-day race. He won a few shorter ultras. But he came to my mind because he was always mentioned in these newspapers about the races, because people focused on him because he was a comedic character. I mean, he was an entertainer, that these massive crowds, sometimes as many as 10,000 in Madison Square Garden at once, would watch these runners run in circles, and they wanted to be entertained either by watching runners faint on the track or hallucinate or go bonkers and do crazy things. That's what they really wanted to see. But also this he had a nickname of Old Sport Campana. He was a character, and he was an entertainer, and he would do antics on the track that made people laugh, and they just appreciated who he was. And so I saw this pattern of him over and over in these races. One reporter I remember said he's worth your price of admission just coming to watch him and his antics.
What did he do? Was he doing cartwheels? Was he?
He would do all sorts of things. And as we talk, you might think about who's the entertainer in the modern sport that we have. But this guy, maybe he's a little like Ed Eddinghausen, the jester. He would wear different costumes. In fact, sometimes he would change them every half hour during a race and entertain people that way. But he, what was interesting about him is he didn't age very well. People thought he was always 10 to 20 years older than he really was. Now, he entered the sport in this.
Interesting.
He entered the sport in his 40s, when most of these ultra runners were in their 20s or early 30s. So he definitely was older, but they thought he was, towards 60 years old. And so they were just fascinated by him. One reporter called him the living skeleton, because it was just so outrageous to see this old man with wrinkled skin doing so well, doing 500 miles in a 6-day race.
So they would literally run around a circle inside Madison Square Garden for 500 miles. Would that be an event that people would show up for or attend at some point during that race?
That spectators would come?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. There were some races during the week. They would, they keep track of the paid admissions, were as much as 100,000 paid admissions during a week. I mean, they would come, and some of the people, especially in New York City, they would have people who would stay all week. They wouldn't even leave. They called them loafers, because they would pay one day and then sleep in the chairs overnight. And sometimes the police tried to get them out, but other times even the runners would play tricks on them, whether trying to give them a hot foot with some fire under them, or paint mustaches on their faces, or all sorts of things. So it was a week-long event with lots of things going on.
So this old sport, as they called him, was he, since he wasn't winning, how was he making money? Was this a hobby for him? Did he have a normal profession, or were the race directors paying him to show up to draw more people into the stadium?
I mean, he tried to get into winning. So as those races evolved, you had to reach a certain number of miles. They agreed on a certain number of miles, whether it's 425, 450, or even 500 miles. If you reached those, then you could take a share of the gate proceedings, the paid admission, where the runners would get 50% of the total income, and the race director would get the rest to pay expenses for the race. So he rarely made the miles to win. So, but he was in so many. I mean, he competed in 33 6-day races during his lifetime. And so,
wow.
Yes, how did he do it? And they tried to keep this secret, but sometimes it came out that the race directors would actually pay him a salary to come, and he had to stay the entire 6 days and compete. And in most of these 6-day races, I'd say 75% of the runners quit before the last day. If they knew they weren't in the money, they would quit. They said, this isn't worth it to kill my body this way. But Campana would almost finish every race, and that's because he was given some sort of salary to entertain.
That's interesting. What was his qualifications? I mean, why did he, at the age of 40 or 40, whatever he was when he started. Why did he start running? Was he a runner before, or was he desperate for money?
Yeah, so he actually was pretty good when he was younger. Now, when his father died when he was, I think, 4 in North Carolina, and then his mother, he moved to New York City. His family did, but then his mother died a few years later. So he was taken in by a fire department there in New York City.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he became a fireman, and then apparently kind of learned to run and did very good. And so then he would enter some races, and if you did good back then, and this is mid 1800s, people would sponsor you. Somebody who had money would say, "Hey, let me enter you in this race. It might be just a 1-mile race or a 5-mile race." And the reason they would do that is because of all the wagering going on. So if they thought they had a good runner, it's just like having a racehorse. I mean, if you have a good racehorse, you put them in races and then wager and can earn a lot of money. And so he did quite well in New York City as he was young. But then the Civil War came around, and he indeed fought in the Civil War, I think for a Pennsylvania group. He claimed that he fought at Gettysburg. And he would always tell the story that at one point of the battle, he started chasing a Confederate soldier. And so they kind of had a race during the battle, and the soldier threw down his gun, and Old Sport, or he's called the Young Sport at that time, Campana, threw down his gun, and he said that's one of the races that he did not win because the guy got away. And so when he came back, he eventually moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and became a street peddler. They had lots of street peddlers that they would peddle all sorts of things, all sorts of food, fruit, and things like that on the street. And he was very good at it, but he had the reputation of being kind of a loafer, they called him. Just kind of hung out and didn't really work hard. But then something turned him around, and he entered the long distance running sport.
And was there a season for this? Was it something that went all year long, or was it like basketball season for us, where it starts on the date opening season and then all the way through to the championship? So was it organized like that, or was it different?
All independent. Although some very rich race managers would create a series of races. The most famous was called the Astley Belt series of races that an Englishman, and in fact a member of Parliament, organized as a competition between Americans and Brits. And that was in 1878. And they started that series. But most of these 6-day races, because they were indoors and you don't have air conditioning, you do have heat. They had furnaces in these places, but it was mostly a winter sport. So it probably start in the fall, but then around May, most of them would quit. But still, I've found many that went year round, but it was mostly seasonal.
I think in your book you talk about, because there was such a big amount of money, and many of these racers were, sponsored and yada yada, that there may have been some impropriety. And I think you talk about some of the impropriety of Old Sport. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, Old Sport, he was mostly a pretty honest guy. Other runners, and there's some stories I have in my books that they would, over the years, finally corruption did come into play, where the bookmakers would try to bribe, whether it's the handlers of a runner, to purposely poison their runner so they would get out of the
Oh,
race.
no.
Yeah. Or try to bribe the runner so he would get out of the race. So what they didn't want, depending on the odds of the race, they didn't want some unknown winning races and then somebody winning just a ton of money, and then the bookmakers would be losing money. So all that did affect. But Old Sport, he was I don't think he ever got bribed, unless you can think of a situation that you remember from the book.
Well,
I don't.
yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah, in the book you talk about an infamous 21-mile record attempt. Yeah, in Bridgeport. Is it a hoax? Tell us about that.
That's a really fun story. So that was his first attempt to be an ultra runner. Dan,
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
First attempt at being an ultra runner, and he goes, how many? 500?
He
What?
wanted to break the world record of 520 miles in 6 days, and he was convinced that he could do it, and he trained. And Daniel O'Leary from Chicago held the record, and so he got in with some guys who must have had money or whatever, and they set up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, up above a store in a pretty tiny room, although they charged admission, and he sold postcards of himself to earn money. But so he ran around in circles in this small track, probably about 40 laps a mile or something.
Wow.
Day and night to break this record. And so it turned out that halfway through, somebody who was pretty smart said, "Hey, we need to remeasure this track," and it was found to be significantly short. Okay, so, but then his handler says, "Oh, we'll fix our figures here," and they took off a lot of miles and had him continue. But so at the end, he got to the end, and indeed, he was believed that he had beat the world record by about a mile. But then later on, stories came out, and I don't think Campana knew this was going on. But while he was sleeping, you had to sleep at times for a few hours each day. They would have a person impersonate him and continue to run on the track and register miles. Okay. And then also they found out that some scorers had been bribed to give him bonus miles along the way. One guy said, "Yeah, I gave him 20 miles extra each day," or something like that. And all this came out much later. But so when he finished, the country really believed that he broke the world record. And the guy who held it previously didn't like that this unknown had done it. So Daniel O'Leary then had to set up a match with him in Madison Square Garden, said, I'm going to prove I can beat this unknown. And sure enough, it wasn't even close. I mean, Campana, I don't know. He made a couple 100 miles, I think, but not clear. And then the hoax story did come out. And then so for that first year, he had a pretty poor reputation. They thought he was a fraud and a faker, but I think it was really the people who were backing him. What they wanted to do was make sure that he did really well, broke the world record, and then they could make a ton of money by putting him in other races.
And no fault to Campana. I mean, if I had to run around my living room couch, for 500 miles, I think I might lose count too.
No, he didn't. Yeah, they kept telling him as he got close to the end. He didn't know how many miles he had. And one thing they kept doing is, "Oh, you have 40 miles left." And he'd ask again, and they say, "Oh, yeah, you have 40 miles left." And then over and over again. And finally he got so discouraged he almost quit. And then they told him the truth, what his miles were. So I'm convinced he really didn't know. He was just going by instructions of the people who were handling it.
So that's where it all started. You can never trust an aid station worker telling you how much further to the next. Oh, it's all uphill. It's all down. They started early with that.
That's right. That is exactly right.
Touche, Freeman.
And maybe he'd never really changed costumes at all. Maybe they just shoved somebody else out there and they go, he changed the costume. That's just a ruse.
Hey, Davey, we've been admiring your dog in the background. It sounds like Old Sport also was a dog lover. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's right. In that race, he had a couple small hounds of some sort that he actually walked with him. I think there were 3 that would take turns and walk with them around there. But unfortunately, one of them got so tired out that it died later on.
So let's try to define, because I know we're very careful, amongst ourselves. We call it ultra running, but we know there's a fair amount of effective and efficient hiking that goes along with that. So we talk about pedestrianism, we talk about ultra running. What did that arena look like? How much running and how much pedestrianing were you doing in that?
Well, when it really started, these 6-day races, I think it was 1875. They started with Edward Payson Weston. He was a walker, and so was Daniel O'Leary. They were, these race walkers. You've seen them, but they could go hundreds and hundreds of miles, and so that's how it started. But then, when both of them went over to England to compete, the Brits were not good in walking, and these guys were just killing them. Every race, the Americans would win, and it just drove the Brits crazy. And so finally, this guy Astley created this series, and he decided to change the rules in 1878 and say, hold it. It's going to be what we call go as you please. And you can run, you can walk, you can crawl, you can do anything. And that was a good move, because a lot of these walkers, it was hard to judge that they were really walking and not running. And so there were a lot of problems and accusations that they were cheating. And so after 1878, most of the races allowed running. So by the time Campana was doing it, he was doing running and walking. If you go to a 6-day race today, on the first day, you'll probably see a lot of running, and then increasingly it gets worse and worse. Where the final days, there's just a lot of walking going on for most of the competitors.
I'm curious. You talk about how many spectators came to watch. What type of people were these? Were these the lowlifes of the community, the gamblers, or were these people that were sports fans that were there to see the amazing physical feats that these guys were completing?
It was a combination. I mean, there were even aristocrats that would come, princes and ladies in fine dresses, and so the newspapers would certainly point those out. But the reputation that came forward was, this sport's a brutal sport, and most of the spectators are these low-class individuals, lots that don't have jobs, and that's why late in the 1800s, New York City and Philadelphia passed laws that you had to limit these races to only 12 hours per day. Because 6-day bicycle races also evolved, and those had terrible crashes. Those were really brutal, and so they wanted to get rid of them. But there are other reasons. I mean, the theaters didn't like them because they were taking away their customers. They're going to watch these races instead of going to the theater. And the clergy didn't like it. They thought it was very brutal, and people got hammered and didn't come to church, the next day. So.
Well, maybe that's why it was 6 days. The 7th day was spent in church, so they tried to keep them happy.
So most of them back then weren't exactly 6 days. They would halt them 2 hours before Sunday hit to allow
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
so they were 142 hours instead of 144. So they would allow people to go back home, hopefully, and go to church the next day.
And I've got to think that the 12-hour rule was just something to try to get some of the loafers out of there. It's like, this is 12 hours. We flash the lights and everybody's cleared out. And, but concessions, I imagine, were a real cost, a revenue stream for these places.
Big time, yeah.
That's a lot of hot dogs.
Yeah, they would describe the beer bars that were like over 50 feet long, or they had all all these beer tenders that would just amazing. But there were concessions and there were activities. There were shooting galleries and all sorts of, almost like it was a circus in the middle of Madison Square Garden. So they'd have all sorts of, always a band, of course. Although one way they tried to halt one race is they found some obscure law that said you couldn't have live music during a certain type of event, and they tried to shut down the band. So they try all sorts of things to shut these races down.
As you were writing all these books and doing all this research, how did these athletes train for these events? Are we training differently? I mean, obviously, in today's time, we can say, I want to train for a 50-mile or a 50K race, get on the internet, and it spits out a training schedule for you. How did they train?
I think similarly, although certainly not going up and down mountains like we train today. So a lot of it was on tracks, and they would train outdoors in all sorts of weather. But yeah, some would train like 40 miles a day, multiple days in a row, as they're preparing for these races. There was in Brooklyn, there was a popular place that they would go that had some sort of indoor track that all these professional racers would go and train on these tracks before these races.
And what kind of footwear did they have? Rubber wasn't invented back then. They had leather shoes.
Yeah, they had.
What were they wearing?
They had super shoes with Max cushions. No. That's why I criticize people trying to limit what shoes you can wear, because it certainly wasn't fair with what they wore back then. Leather shoes. And some of them even had zero drop shoes back then.
Oh.
But they were leather. They would do all sorts of things to avoid blisters. They would a lot of it was soaking their feet in alcohol or booze, and sometimes they would pour it in their shoes. I don't know how that helped, but maybe with the leather. But doing all sorts of things that they could do to avoid blisters. Many would wear gaiters because the tracks, what they were composed of was both dirt, but then on top they would put sawdust. So they were sawdust tracks with probably a 2-inch layer of sawdust, and they would roll them out with these heavy rollers to make it a fairly soft surface for them to run on.
I get blisters. I don't know whether I've ever tried soaking my feet in alcohol. Maybe I need to give that a try.
Do that before you get the blister, Scott. I would not recommend afterwards.
No, that would hurt.
That's smart.
Was this primarily in America that this happened, or did it escalate to a worldwide craze?
It was America, then America and Canada, and then the Brits took hold of it for a while, but they were kind of the first to kind of get rid of it. They didn't bring in as much money as the Americans did, so a lot of these Brit runners who were very good, they immigrated to America so they could continue to race in the 1890s. By the 1890s, England mostly wasn't doing it. And England wasn't happy about having women compete either, but the women races were pretty big in America. Mm-hmm. And then Australia took hold, so there were quite a few races in Australia, and Americans went to compete there, and the Australians came to compete in America too.
Why and how did we forget about this? I mean, obviously, these 6-day races stopped happening, and we forgot about it. When did it stop, and why?
Yeah, and that's a source of confusion. Some of the historians who've tried to write about this, I think they've given wrong reasons as I've went much deeper. Some said roller skating made it go away, but no, that only became a fad for a couple of years. And they said, well, okay, the bike races became more popular. Yeah, that contributed. But what really contributed was making wagering illegal.
Oh.
That was key. If you can't come to these races and wager, it's like without watching football without fantasy football. If you took that away, the viewership would go extremely down. Well, these wagering went away, and then they had some financial depressions in the 1890s that were, nobody had the big money to create these races, and so it started fizzling out. But my belief was in around 1906. Believe it or not, a marathon craze started. When 26.2 was competed in the Olympics. All of a sudden, these runners, instead of trying to run really long distance, ultra distances, they wanted to run the marathon. And so during that year, I was just amazed as I researched how many of these marathons were held. And they weren't the type of marathons that we do. A lot of them were indoors on these indoor tracks. But they wouldn't last for days and days. So I think the marathon craze that they had there in the early 1900s really put the nail in the coffin. But then world events, World War I and the Depression and so forth really kicked it.
And I don't have time to look up on use the internet to figure out when Prohibition started, but I've got to think that back to that 50-foot bar that you were talking about.
That's right.
You take away the 50-foot bar, it might change interest a little bit.
Yeah, they did. There were some laws against that, and so even some of the race directors, when it wasn't illegal, they would say we don't want drinking in this race, and so if there's no drinking, why come and watch? If you don't come and watch, then there isn't as much paid admission, and then there's not enough winnings for these runners. And if there's not winnings, then these runners will stop doing it.
I'm starting to see a real reason of why the runners were saying they were soaking their feet in alcohol. They say, oh no, I need this for blister control.
They would drink a lot. During races. That really helped them stay awake.
The racers did too?
Oh yeah. Champagne
really?
was big to try to keep them awake and some of them would get drunk. And just think of as this sleep deprived runner that is drunk and what they're doing on the track, and that's where the entertainment. And Campana, he would get drunk at times going around the track.
We laugh, but you don't drink during your runs, Davey? No, kidding.
Oh, that's fun. So what can we learn from these guys and gals that were doing this? I mean, as I read your books, I'm thinking, right now, I think it's either finishing or finished is the big 300-mile race down in Arizona. And we're thinking, holy cow, 300 miles, we were thinking 200 miles was the next 100 miles. And here these guys were going much further than that. What can we learn from them?
Their goal, they thought they could push the world record past 600 miles. And so a race that said we have the best in the world running and they're going to break the world record, that brought in a lot of interest in a lot of people. And in fact, the world record did pass 600 miles. I can't remember how many. I think at least 6 runners that passed that threshold. And so a world record was set, I think 623 and that was not broken until Yanis Kuris broke it in the 1980s. So they went very far and were very good.
You talked about men and women competing. Did they ever compete together? Were there separate races, or were they combined?
Normally, those were more of exhibitions, but they would. Sometimes men would compete against women, and sometimes they would give the women handicaps. And said the men have to go this far, women have to go this far. There weren't a lot of those, so most of them were women just competing against women and men against men.
It makes me think that if we could fast forward and have four people talking about a podcast here, like we're doing here, that we would talk about, and they would do this mountain race, and they'd start at one point and they'd run through the mountain up and down. At different points, they have aid stations along, and people would think that's just incredible. It gets kind of ignorant. Why would they do such a thing? As we're talking about running in a circle, around a couch to get their miles in.
Well, as I've read, one thing I like to do is read the old ultra-running magazines and so forth. And so back in the 80s, when trail ultras really started, it's kind of interesting to read the letters to the editors that people would say, why are these people going out, jumping over logs and doing this crazy, and they would say that isn't running. They aren't races. Those are just adventure hikes. And so it really took quite a few years. But then things kind of by the 1990s, there started to be more mountain trail ultras than there were the track and road ones over that time.
So as we're talking to the historian here, why don't you turn your hat around and become a futurist? Where do you think ultra running is going? Well, we've qualified you on the podcast here. We can do that.
That's a good question. I think there's been a resurgence in road and track ultras, and it's certainly a strong resurgence in 6-day races. I don't know if I've kind of helped that a little bit as people have learned more about the history and tried to bring that history back. So that's a good question. For me, I think trails, I mean, I started as a trail runner, but I dabbled then in the road and track ultras, but I've always loved the trails far more. So I think part of it is what's your enjoyment? But for them back then, I mean, their goal was not to finish a race. Their goal was to get in the winnings and get money. And so I don't know if our futuristic races will attract a lot of money. If it did, that certainly could influence who's competing. Are we getting more of these marathon runners into ultras because there's more money, or what? I don't know. I don't know where the future is. Hopefully they won't pass laws against ultra running.
Maybe we need to start wagering. I've noticed that I see a lot more ads now for wagering on sporting events through different apps. Maybe we need to start. Maybe that's what Ultra Running Magazine needs to start their own betting app or something like that. Davy has done so much research into this. This book, I believe, is the 13th in your Ultra Running History series. At least that's what I'm looking on the inside cover of your book. It looks like it's number 13. You've written a few more books besides that. You're also the director of, and I'm going to get it right. What is it? The American
Ultra Running Hall of Fame.
Yes. What is that? Tell us a little bit about that. And why we should know.
That's a Hall of Fame that was started. What year was it? Like 2009. By Dan Brannon. They realized that the U.S. Track and Field Hall of Fame would never put ultra runners in it. There's just way too many that ultra running was just too niche. And so he started this Hall of Fame, putting in Ted Corbett first. Very appropriate, and Sandra also. And so and each year he would put in a single runner, and over the years they did honor a lot of, and mostly road runners for quite a while. And it got to a point where Dan, getting up in years, said, I need to turn this over to somebody else. And he saw what I was doing and asked if I would take it over. So I've had it for several years. I changed it a bit. I thought that the sport has grown enough where certainly we could put 2 in each year. And I've tried to concentrate and pull a lot of these trail runners, start doing trail runners. Scott Jerk made it in a couple of years ago, and others. So it's an honor. It's. I mean, we don't have a place for you to go through a museum and see some of these stinking shoes and things like that. So it's all on my website at ultrarunninghistory.com. So I write an article about each of one and try to honor them and make people remember who these people are.
Davy just hasn't written about ultra running and creating a place for memory and for the history. You're also an accomplished ultra runner. I have here, Scott had sent me a note that you finished 108 100-mile races. And that's an enormous number of miles and bibs to give you the perspective of a runner yourself.
There's a small number of people that have run over 100 hundreds, right?
So as I was starting to get up there, probably reaching about 70 or 80, I thought, man, how many people have had as many finishes as I did? So I did do deep research, and the community helped me find these people. And it turned out in 2018, I became the 15th person to reach the 100 race limit or milestone. And so now I have been 30 that have reached it. So once I started writing about these, and people now set goals. I'm amazed how many people are trying to get there. And I think before the year is out, 5 or 6 more are going to reach it. There's several that are around 95 now. They're trying to get it done.
Well, I want to put this in a little bit of perspective. When did you start? When was your first 100-mile race? And how many years did it take you to get to 108?
My first was in 2005. The first one I finished was in 2005, was Rocky Raccoon in Texas. And
so 20 years.
Yeah.
That's a lot of running in 20 years.
And then those first few years, I didn't have it figured out. I mean, I'd only finished 2, maybe 3 at most for several years until I finally figured it out. And then those final years, so I was getting to a point where I could do about 12, finish 12 a year. I could run at least 1 a month. And so they started piling up.
Dave, you said until you figured it out, and I think
right.
Is that where you go?
Exactly what I heard.
All right, let me ask, because we're all wondering if Scott and I both had the question at the same time, and Ryan stood up and said, "Let me have this question too. What did you figure out?"
So that's probably a lie. I don't think anybody ever figures 100 miles out. But let's just put it this way: I stopped DNFing them. I had a string of, I think, 36 finishes without a DNF, and most of them were trail races, tough ones, Wasatch and Cascade Crest and the Bear, and a lot of races like that. I think what you figure out is first your fitness, getting to a point where I could recover from a 100-mile race in about 3 days without sore muscles.
Wow!
And the way I did that for about a 3-year period, every week on a Saturday, I would try to run at least 50K to 50 miles in a single run. And so I got my body, used to running often in these long distance races. And then during the week, I wouldn't run that much. One year I only averaged, I went through the stats, I only averaged 2.5 days per week running, yet I ran a total of 5,000 something miles during the year. So I learned that, but I think the key thing to learn is that during a race, how do you keep yourself balanced with fueling and fluids and carbohydrates and electrolytes, so you keep everything in balance and you don't start bonking or get dehydrated or all those things that kind of can kill your race. And the only thing, everybody's different, and so you only figure that out through experience with your own body. And every time I'd finish a race or not finish a race, I would, okay, what went wrong? What could I improve? How come my feet hurt so much? I guess my feet have grown. I need to have bigger shoes now. Things just like that. That it took me a while to figure out.
Did you have? Let me back up and make this more specific question. For nutrition, did you have a formula that you used at so many carbs or whatever every hour or 45 minutes? Or did you just listen to your body and say, I need something now? Was it more of intuitive or more formulaic?
Mostly listen to the body. Although back then, they were preaching about 300 calories per hour. And so I would always keep that in mind. And during the first 50 of 100, I would mostly do fluids. I would use diluted Ensure in my handheld bottles and just sip on them as I would run along, and use gels and hit an aid station and maybe stuff a little peanut butter jelly sandwich down my throat and, continue on, or hit an aid station and make sure I drink, several cups of Coke and keep moving. And then I'd have different signs. I could tell I was getting dehydrated, and hopefully I catch those signs in time to, avoid that, because once that happens, man, that can just kill you for a couple hours, or during the night, your body just says, oh man, you killed me during the day. Now I'm not going to help you during the night. So I learned those kind of things.
As much as things have changed, shoes, gear, materials for a rain jacket has changed. Everything has changed, except as I think about it, the aid stations seem to look a lot alike. They haven't seemed to change too much in many years. Davey?
Well, back in the 19th century, they were kind of similar too. I mean, they did a lot of ginger ale. What they did was a lot of protein, though, a lot of beef soup. This Campana guy, though, what he liked to do was eat raw oysters with chili sauce.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he would eat a ton of these things. But they would do all sorts of things. I mean, but when you read the details of what they ate, they said, no, that's not all that much. And they figured out electrolytes. They figured out salt, how important that was back then, and things like that.
So you also write a blog, and of course there'll be links to all of these things we talk about in the show notes. And I was reading it before we scheduled this interview with you, and I was not aware that a couple years ago you were having some knee issues and decided knee replacement surgery was a good solution for your ailments. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so on one knee, I had torn my meniscus skiing before I became a runner. And so I had the surgery to kind of clean that out. And the doctor, when I woke up, said, no more running. I wasn't even a runner yet. I go, what? But I was starting to hike. So I did eventually put 50,000 miles on that knee. And I did return to that doctor. I remember I returned to that doctor years later for my other knee and told him, hey, you told me not to run, but I've put 40,000 on. And he was so thrilled. He took me around to his nurses and started bragging what I did. But anyway, then eventually I, at Rocky Raccoon one year after they had the terrible hurricane there, and that exposed so many roots on that trail. I fell so many times during a race that I tore the meniscus on my other knee and had the surgery. And then once you have those surgeries, it seems like then those meniscuses can wear down a lot faster than before. So eventually I got to a point, I can't remember, it was at 20 or so, how across the years, I remember I finished 100. It was so painful. And I told Jamil, I said, this is my last 100. I can't do this anymore. It just hurt so much. I still hoped, I tried injections and all sorts of things. But it just got to a point where even a 3-mile run, I would come home in pain and say, that wasn't fun. And tried all sorts of things. I took up biking and started enjoying that. But finally, I saw a buddy of mine when I was helping at an aid station at Wasatch, and I told him my sad story, and he pointed to his knee. I saw the scar. He says, I had mine replaced. and you're running Wasatch? I could not believe it. And so that kind of kicked me to saying, well, maybe I should try. And I finally made the decision to take the leap and replaced my right first, and 2 months later I did my left. And doctor confirmed. He said, I can't believe what you were doing on these bone-on-bone knees for so long.
When the doctor saw you, he said, no, Davy, I think there was a misunderstanding. I didn't say start running. I said no running.
No running, yeah. No. Well, it's funny. He saw my face when I said, what? And then he said, well, if you must, stick to trails. And I also said, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can do that.
A fitting message for Trail Runner Nation listeners. Good.
That's right. So, for that first knee, it really took a couple of years for the pain to go away, but eventually it mostly did. And I when I hit about 50 years old, that was the peak of my career. I started winning races, winning 100-milers, and doing very good. So, I mean, even though I was old and had a bad knee, things came together eventually. Well, and how am I doing now? Well, I'm now 66. So, yeah, just finishing 100-miler is tough when you're 66. I tried a couple recently and didn't quite make it. The knees don't hurt, but they're not necessarily comfortable. Although I can go bike 100 miles in a day easily. I've been skiing like crazy this winter. I discovered the knees do fine skiing. You don't have to bend them as far, and I even do moguls. So I'm happy to keep doing endurance sports. I'm not running or training as much as I used to, though.
Well, there's more than one way to do endurance sports, and there's more than one form of getting out there and doing it. So you've got quite a lead at 108 finishes on 100 miles. You've got quite a leap on most of us.
109. I have done
109. My apologies.
I did do one since my replacement, and it was on the treadmill. So
that counts. I'm gonna give that a thumbs up.
Yeah, treadmill is nice and soft, and I found that the knees were happy about that. I guess if you're happy about running 100 miles on the treadmill.
Hey, I'm curious. You're at 13 books in this ultra running series, ultra running history series. How many more are out there, or are you just going to keep going as you do the research?
I'm probably taking a break. If I do one, I'd probably write one about the Hall of Fame members. I've written kind of long articles about them, but I'm kind of taking a break. I recently got elected to be the vice president of the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And so I'm really helping that society with their history and their online websites and so forth that to help that organization grow. So we're at GrandCanyonHistory.org. Come be a member. We need members.
Sounds good. Davey, we're grateful that we have somebody standing guard at our history, making sure the right people are promoted and the right story is told, and that we know exactly where we came from and why the community has deep ties. And it doesn't come from just now; it comes from what's happened in the past. So thank you for bringing it up. You're a legend and appreciate it.
Let me make sure. Let me read something about this Campana guy that.
Please.
Yeah, sure. Kind of helps you understand. This is from a newspaper. This is a reporter who watched him run. And he wrote, his body bore every appearance of having been for several hours in a threshing machine. And yet his miraculous head rolled in a gleeful sort of way between his shoulder blades. Apparently he always had his head kind of cranked to one side. His shriveled, shrunken, crooked figure is one of the marvels of pedestrianism. He looks like a physical wreck, and every stranger expects to see him collapse momentarily. He goes shambling along in stocking feet with no more style than a bag of bones, his arms working feebly, head on one side and tongue out. Whenever anyone looked at him, he would dart forward with renewed vigor, his arms and legs flying in all directions as if hung on wires. And so that's why he was so entertaining. They just couldn't believe that this guy could run the miles that he did.
And I think at the finish line at many of these ultras, you could probably write that same excerpt of some of the people that we see coming through the last 100 yards of a 100 miler.
History repeats itself.
One thing he did do different, people would at times mock him. One time a young boy yelled, "Go sell your face to a drugstore," or they would really make fun of him. Well, how would he respond? Well, he would very often jump over the fence. They would have this railing, this track to keep the spectators off the track. He would jump over, sock the guy right in the face, and then give him a black eye, and then jump right back on the track and continue on. And nobody would do anything about that. I mean, they said, well, the guy.
Maybe that was more acceptable then, huh?
So
maybe we need to institute that into our societies now. I don't know.
So that's why I wrote the book about this crazy guy. Is this all the crazy antics about him? That each page there's this kind of shocked. Wow, did he really do that? And why didn't they put him in jail? For a lot of the things that he did.
We only scratched the surface of a couple of the stories, but the book is full of them, and it's like you said, a page turner with content that makes you scratch your head a few times. Did this really happen?
Yeah.
Where is the best place for someone to get these books, Davey?
Yeah, the only place is Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go to Amazon and put in their search bar Ultrarunning history, maybe put Crockett by it, it'll pull up quite a few of these books. And then there's one page they have the series, Ultrarunning series page that has all 13 listed in, paperback, hardback, and one of them's an Audible book, and I'll probably do some more Audible books.
Do you read
one of the things? Oh, go
ahead. Do you read the Audible, or do you have somebody else read them? Because I'm curious about that.
I did do my own, but interesting now, Amazon and Audible now are allowing AI. And so, in fact, they put me on their program, said, hey, so I've started, my first book, Frank Hart, I thought maybe I'll try using their tool to see how, so they have these readers, not a real person reading your book for you. And you just have to go along and clean things up when they don't actually say things right. They you can make corrections.
Well, they can mimic and match your voice, so no one would ever know unless you told us.
They have a lot better voices than me.
I love audiobooks, but I'm going to discourage you from doing the audio version or doing both of them, because one of the things I do love about your books, Davy, is all of the photos,
pictures,
of the newspaper articles or the diagrams, or there's pictures of what these tracks may have looked like. I don't know if that's a artist rendition, but it really, almost every page has some sort of a drawing or a photo or a caption from a newspaper, and I love looking at that.
I like that too. You're right. Yeah, the Audible book that I did was for the Grand Canyon rim to rim history, and mostly because a lot of these runners heading to the Grand Canyon, they'll put my book. They'll listen to the book as they're driving to the Grand Canyon. Actually, so I thought that has worked out.
Well, Davey, thank you so much for another great book and another great discussion. We really appreciate what you do to help us understand a little bit more about ourselves through the history lens. Make sure everyone out there that you go get these books and read them. It will actually entertain you. Plus, it will help you understand where we came from. Put on your shoes, lace up your laces, or if you have those BOA things, tighten those up if you have those new fancy BOA laces. But more importantly, hit the trails and run
Mas. Scott, I thought you were going to tell us to put our feet in bourbon or something. I thought we learned that.
Oh, yeah, and put your feet in bourbon.